We intend to uphold the administration's commitment to ensure effectiveness and accountability to the U.S. taxpayer. Rigorous monitoring and evaluation help to ensure the effectiveness of USAID's programs. That being said, not everything we do always turns out the way we planned, so we will continue to manage our risks well, learn from experience, and correct course where necessary. In conclusion, the United States has a continued commitment to a partnership with African governments, partners, and other donors grounded in mutual responsibility and respect. USAID has a very real role in safeguarding the United States' national security and economic opportunities. As we continue to work with our partners toward our shared goals over the coming months, I look forward to a continued conversation on USAID's work in Africa. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee. I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you so very much for your testimony. To begin the questioning, just let me ask you first, in the year 2000, I authored the Admiral Nance Meg Donovan International Relations Act. It passed the House, wasn't taken up by the Senate, so I attached it in its entirety to that year's appropriations bill. Much of it focused on the issue of security for U.S. personnel abroad, whether it be at USAID missions or our embassies themselves, with a heavy emphasis on setbacks, securing the windows so that they're less vulnerable to terrorist attack. And it came right out of the bombings in Dar es Salaam and the bombing in Nairobi in 1997, when we learned a painful lesson that international terrorism was transnational and that they would hit softer targets, believing that we would be less prepared. So my first question really is along the lines of the commitment that began then under that law, and the appropriators have been very faithful and I think diligent in trying to ensure that the setbacks and the compounds within which our deployed personnel work and our contract workers, including a number of indigenous people from each of these countries, is sufficient to protect. And I'm wondering if you could tell us if in your opinion, Ambassador, that is true and reflected in this year's budget.
And first is thank you very much for those efforts. So of our 44 embassies, and we have another 6 consulates and other offices for a total of 50, and we have about 1,200 officers and 3,200 other agencies working in those missions. We have about 30 or so missions and offices that have been or under construction under the new standards for security. And so those monies have been put to good use. The security development, I think the Secretary raised it very clearly on the diplomatic security and the funding. So that continues. We still have several embassies that are now under construction. In fact, this week we'll be opening 2 new chancelleries out of Mauritania and in Chad. So thank you very much for that work, Mr. Congressman.
I'll never forget when Admiral Crow, who was then headed up the Accountability Review Boards and testified before my committee then, back in 1998, made the case that, wonderful people from the United States travel abroad, often at great risk to themselves from disease as well as terrorism. We should at least ensure that the physical plant and the protocols that are in place to protect them are as robust as they can be, and that was the reason for the law in the beginning. So I'm grateful that progress continues under your watch. One area of concern with regards to this year's budget request, which I think, frankly, is in the process of being overcome through the appropriations process, and that is the issue of Feed the Future. In the last Congress, I was the author on the House side of the Global Food Security Act, with a big emphasis on ensuring that nutrition, proper supplementation was provided for, and yet this year's budget calls for very significant cuts in Feed the Future and an elimination of the Food for Peace program. I don't believe that will happen, and I'm concerned that I wish it wasn't even in the budget request to begin with. Already in the appropriations bill as passed by the House, that is largely overcome with bipartisan efforts to ensure that that important food security is available. But if you would like to speak to that, and in like manner, PEPFAR, a visionary bill authored originally by Congressman Henry Hyde, who was chairman of our full committee, but also especially inspired by George W. Bush, who said, "This pandemic must end." I remember Henry Hyde explaining it, and he said, "If left untreated, this will be like the bubonic plague," and was already claiming the lives of so many millions of men, women, and children in the United States, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, where it was particularly raging and destroying human life. There's a significant cut as well in PEPFAR. Again, on the good news front, I don't think it's going to happen. Already in this budget, we're talking the budget that the House has passed for approps talks about $6 billion being allocated, through the PEPFAR program and through USAID as well. So I think it will be overcome by congressional intervention. But if you would speak to how important these programs and others, it's not. I've been here through both Democrat and Republican administration. I remind my colleagues that President Obama sent up budgets that cut tuberculosis by 20%. We added it all back. He had a program that cut neglected tropical diseases efforts, which were at $100 million, cut it by $20 million. We put it back. I tried to get it to $125 million, failed, but at least we got it back to straight lining. And Mr. Meeks and I have introduced a bill that would significantly prioritize these horrific neglected tropical diseases, including worms, which about 1 billion people carry worms, which is unconscionable. Even think what that must be like. Rather than feed the future with food, we're feeding the worms. So we really want to ensure that people have healthier guts and parasites are destroyed inside of this very vulnerable groups of people all over the world, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa. But if you could speak to PEPFAR and this effort, again, I do think, and I think the record should show it, this year's budget already makes it clear that that money is going back into the budget. And perhaps you might want to speak to how well utilized that money could be to ensure that these vulnerable populations are cared for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would emphasize that as we formulated the budget for FY18, we worked to reflect the President's America First policy and the foreign policy priorities of the administration. So we focused our resources on the programs and the countries and the subregions where we felt we could maximize our impact on national security, on U.S. economic interests, U.S. influence in leadership, and also efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability to the American taxpayer. So we made some tough choices. And I would like to emphasize that at any budget level, we always have to make sure that we are efficient with our use of resources, and it's always a very good exercise to see how we can be more efficient. It's also important for us to look to others to do more, including helping our host countries to mobilize domestic resources, to help mobilize private capital for development objectives. That said, we absolutely recognize the importance of food security and appreciate the Global Food Security Act. Feed the Future has already done quite a bit towards the development of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We're particularly concerned about building resilience to future shocks that we know will be coming, especially drought in some of the areas of sub-Saharan Africa where we see recurring problems. We also realize that the work that we do in food security and making the value chains more efficient is good for U.S. businesses. So we did announce a new set of target countries for Feed the Future, and we will continue to prioritize our resources as much as we can in the countries where we'll have a good impact. On PEPFAR, and on health in general, I think you'll see in the FY18 budget, the line item for PEPFAR actually went up a little bit. And we recognize the importance of continued investments in health and especially in HIV and AIDS.
I noticed in the explanation before, Ambassador Yamamoto, the administration said that nobody would lose their ARVs. Anybody who was on treatment would continue receiving it. And that's important for a number of reasons. Obviously, you don't want people who are HIV positive, obviously getting full-blown AIDS and suffering the ravages of that deadly disease. But I think one of the greatest stories that remains largely told in policy circles, but not in the general public, is that the viral load, as you know, is so significantly reduced through treatment, not just preventive means, but the treatment itself brings down that viral load. So the more we provide treatment, the more we are lessening or mitigating the transmission of this horrific disease. So I think so I'm glad to hear of the increase, because I think it's needed. And then some. And I do believe, as you've noted, and I've read the budget recommendations, we want to get others to do more. And that's an important, concept. And it's, the American taxpayer demands that others step up and do more, particularly in the European Union, where much more could be done. But that said, for people who are suffering starvation or the ravages of disease, it seems to me that we always should be the firstest with the mostest to make sure that they survive and thrive, even if the others do not step up to the plate. That's just my thoughts on that. Ambassador.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and really for all your great work for this committee. So just to kind of emphasize that the overall budgeting, if you look at the $5.2 billion 2018 request, it's still over about 81%, which has not really changed in the past. So 81% towards health and overall health care issues. But I think what's really important is that, over the years, since PEPFAR has developed and Feed the Future, we're seeing what the ambassadors are doing and what we're doing with AID directors in the field is doing much more integration. So in other words, building on other pots of funding and also programs and kind of bring it together. So for instance, when you see the PEPFAR countries from Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, Namibia, Nigeria, that's just not receiving PEPFAR money, but they're also receiving economic support funds. The other issue too is military assistance to help for security issues, education, agriculture. The other issue too is looking at supporting our NGO partners, the faith-based groups, etc. And so it's really a much more holistic, cohesive group. The other thing too is I think we've learned from a lot of areas. I think when I was the ambassador in Ethiopia, we had a problem about how to utilize all the funding. And I think through your guidance and the guidance from AID, we've done a much better job of really utilizing effectively and saving a lot of taxpayer money. So thank you.
Ranking Member Bass.
I just have to, I want to compliment both of you for incredible careers and contributions that you've made to our country through your service over the years. And you don't need to answer this, but I know that you have to support this budget, and it must be very painful because this is just filled with contradictions. You ran through, Ms. Anderson, you ran through, I think I lost track of some of your points, but, U.S. national security to advance peace. You talked about U.S. leadership and influence and efficiency and effectiveness and accountability. I think there was one I missed. Did I miss one?
U.S. economic interests.
Yeah, U.S. economic interest, and you also said America first. And to me, America first doesn't mean we abdicate our leadership role. And so for national security and advancing peace, and then the budget proposes cutting peacekeeping and cutting development. So to me, that's a direct contradiction. U.S. leadership and influence, Feed the Future is a perfect example of U.S. leadership. I think it's one of the best programs we've had, and the chairman's leadership in it. Instead of us providing food to Africa, Africa can feed itself. And us providing technology and our scientific expertise so that we can build the capacity rather than have this charity approach, to me, is U.S. leadership. We complain about the role of the Chinese, well, this budget has us stepping back, in my opinion. When you're looking for efficiency and effectiveness, I'm wondering if instead of cutting programs, you are looking at or examining any outside contracting that might be done. And, if that's an area where you could look at cutting instead of cutting things like some of the programs that we've talked about. I wanted to ask you about a couple of things health-related. One, it's my understanding, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but that the budget would dramatically reduce reproductive health programs and family planning. And one of the problems in Africa is maternal deaths. And one of the reasons why you have maternal deaths is when women cannot space their pregnancy. And so, if I am reading it right, what is the logic in cutting it back? Again, we can make decisions about national security. We can put all of our resources in the military, or we can help address some of the root causes for the conflicts to begin with. And it seems like this budget is very short-sighted, and why I said it's full of contradictions. Now, it's a perfect example of why I'm thankful we have 3 equal branches of government so that we can push back and not fund the way this budget is proposing to fund Africa-related programs. So I want to ask, am I correct in looking that essentially family planning would be zeroed out, if not drastically reduced? You can answer that, one of you.
That's correct. We have zeroed out family planning in the FY18 budget.
And what's the reason?
That's
What's the logic
that's
for that?
a policy decision.
Yeah, I know, it's a policy
Be happy
decision.
to take
Why?
your thoughts back.
I know that funding is cut for anything related to climate change, and unfortunately, Africa and a lot of the problems that happen in Africa, the natural disasters, are completely related to climate change. So is that just using the budget to express an ideology?
Again, that was a policy decision. I would go back to family planning and note that we continue our commitment to the health of women and children with our other health programs, including maternal and child health and malaria programming and HIV and AIDS
Maternal
programming.
and child health, one of the reasons for maternal death are not being able to space your pregnancy. So you provide it in one side and then contribute to the problem in another way? Yes, go ahead.
So, you raise a very cogent and very difficult question. And the challenges that we had in trying to fashion the budget, and a lot of difficult decisions are made. But then on the other side too is we're looking at for more efficiencies. And so I'll give you one example is on maternity and infant mortality rates. So looking at different pots of monies and looking at what's really makes sense. So for instance, in East Africa, where you have in many countries and areas is 1 out of every 10 will die before the age of 5. So to survive to 5 is really one of our basic AID campaign.
Which is our chairman's program as well, the
It's
first
probably
1,000
one of the
days.
most effective. And the areas that we have to depend on the contributions from NGO groups, the other issue too is faith-based groups, and we really connected with a lot of faith-based groups in the United States, from Oklahoma to Virginia to other places in eastern United States. And so those, right, it doesn't make up all the issues that we need to do and to address, but it makes up a significant. The other part is one of the things that
What do the faith-based groups have to do with it? I'm
because
missing
they've
your
helped us.
point.
So for instance, in Ethiopia, Somalia, you don't have incubators. And so what they've done is they've made these skull caps,
Oh.
which is to help. And then we bring in, it's called, the mothers are called, we call them kangaroos, because what they do is they because there's no incubators, they hug the child
Right,
until they survive. The other area too is,
keep the child warm.
and then the other issue too is looking at food aid and food assistance, and then food development issues to help feed children, etc. The other issue too that we really is kind of plaguing us is medical care and health care. So for instance, when we were doing a data dumping on some of the countries, particularly Ethiopia, we were noticing that a lot of doctors there were more Ethiopian doctors outside of Ethiopia than inside Ethiopia.
There were more what?
Ethiopian doctors
Right.
in Botswana, even in Washington,
Probably in Los
DC.
Angeles.
Yes, Washington, D.C. So the issue comes as, what do you do? And so we learned from the U.S. program EMTs and how to do basic EMT work and having basic healthcare providers. And so they're low cost, a lot of contributions and private sector support, and so that helps to address a lot of the basic, maternity and infant mortality issues.
When we had a hearing, the Deputy Secretary testified before the full committee regarding the State Department's redesign plan, which really seems like it's a mess. I mean, you might be able to talk about that, all of the combination of programs. But in particular, I asked about a special envoy, specifically to South Sudan. And the Deputy Secretary thought that the special envoy was put in statute by Congress. And that's not the case, apparently. So what we have been told is that the Department of State believes that the responsibilities can be administratively realigned to be covered by the DAS within the Bureau of African Affairs. And so I want to know if you can provide additional details about the DAS that will cover this and how we think, especially given, again, I mean, it's the short-sightedness. So we pass close to $1 billion for famine, and then we remove the special envoy to South Sudan?
And so from your travels and visits to the region, you see very much the problems of not only 1.3 million refugees from South Sudan going into Uganda and other problems. What we've done on the decision made by the Secretary is that we have the envoy back into the Bureau. And so we still have those FTE positions. So in other words, the positions. So what we want to do is really kind of refocus. And we've been coordinating with the P3s and our donor colleagues, particularly the special reps that they have from Norway, the UK, and then looking at the African Union and saying, how can we, the United States, play a
I thought we cut the African Union. We cut funding to the African Union.
But the issue is that we're coordinating with them because they play a critical role, particularly in the high-level dialogue run by Ethiopia's Haile Mariam and Uganda's Museveni with Salva Kiir in southern Sudan. So based on that, we're looking at how we can realign and support these efforts, and then using our positions to use senior officers to play critical roles in support of and also taking leads in certain areas. And that's something that we're still looking at, but I think I have a little more confidence now as we look in reshaping and redirect our operations.
So you don't think a special envoy is needed?
At this point, the decision has been made that we will not have a special.
That was a good answer. You didn't answer that, but I understand that. I really do. I feel like both of you, this budget does not reflect your illustrious careers, and I'm sorry that you have to be put in a position to defend it. My final question is, I'm sorry.
If I could just, make one clarification on the development budget for African Union. If you're looking at the line items, it's showing a zero, but we will be providing funding through the regional account.
So the chairman asked you a question, Ambassador, about embassy security, and you mentioned that several embassies were online to be built. What about the DRC? That embassy, when I went there, the place was falling apart.
That's an issue that we've been working on for years. We've asked President Kabila to give us land so we can start building, and that's something that we're going to be pushing very vigorously because we really need to get our people into safe, secure areas. And that's one of our top priorities.
Well, even if he doesn't give land, do we have anything in the budget to repair that place? Because literally it looked like it was falling apart.
And we have done based on DS security regulations to look at how we can upgrade what we have now. But the bottom line is that we need to have a new embassy, and that's what we're looking and focusing on and working with the government on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to attend a Middle East and Northern African hearing, so I just wanted to ask one question. Mr. Ambassador, you touched on it. I think you also did, Ms. Anderson, about efficiencies and reviewing where are we getting the best results from the efforts that we're making and where we're placing our resources. Can you touch on some of the findings that you may have found as you review whether or not some of the programs are as efficient as we would hope they'd be, and then maybe some other areas that you might look at in the future to see where we could reallocate resources so we're getting better results for our efforts?
So as we're looking at the security environment right now, and the problems we're seeing is flow of arms, criminal syndicates going through Central African Republic, and then posing problems to the G5 countries, those are like Mauritania, Chad, Niger, etc., is what is it that we need to do to kind of bolster the security? And the issue is that you don't want to do it alone. So from the UN General Assembly on, we've really worked very effectively and hard with the P3s, that's the UK and France, and then other donor countries, and then also the African Union and the regional states, so ECOWAS and other issues, and then looking at what they're providing assistance or what they see the issues are, then looking at our own funding that we've given to countries. And so what we've done is, if you look at the budget, you see a lot of countries that are being decreased by 20%, 30%, or what have you. But if you look at the regional funding, that's where we're looking at trying to use that as an assistance or a reserve to look at the most critical areas that we need to provide assistance. So in other words, we have I'll give you some examples on the funding. So we have $131 million that's going to the Chad Basin countries. That's, Nigeria, Mauritania, and Niger. And then we look at the Trans-Sahel and the TSCTP on the west side and the PREACT on the east side. And so as we see problems developing, we can use the funding from these regional bases to help support and bolster these countries' security.
Sanderson?
I would say a few things on finding efficiencies in our programming. We have had a major push on putting more rigor into our monitoring and evaluation since 2011. And that's good because that's a very good way to look back at the evaluations and see where we can find efficiencies. A couple of things: when we have very small programs, it takes a long time to mobilize and it can be quite costly, but I also appreciate Ranking Member Bass's comment about looking at some of the big outside contracting. So that's also where we will be looking. And then on the other side of things, improving our partnerships with the host country governments, with civil society, so that we truly have a partnership and are planning and working together towards the same objective, because what we always want to be doing is working towards a time where we don't have to have a big program that's as involved as maybe we have previously. And another aspect of that is finding ways that we can mobilize the private sector, private capital. I think we've done a pretty good job in Power Africa and even Feed the Future in mobilizing private capital for some of the infrastructure and other investments that are needed for development.
I have to excuse myself, but I thank both of you for your service to our country.
Thank you. Dr. Burr?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start asking my questions, again, I appreciate both of you being here. I appreciate both of your long service to our country, and understand that your job as career diplomats are to implement the policies of the administration. I also do want to just give a shout out to the many employees of the State Department for the work that they're doing, representing the United States, both here and abroad, under difficult circumstances, often having, my opinion, often having to implement policies that they don't believe in, but doing their job every day. I also, as a message to the administration, they are very much undercutting our ability to be the great country that we are. America is a better place, and the world is a better place when America is engaged globally. We've seen that in the second half of the 21st century, or the 20th century, when we've been leading with our values of compassion, our values of leadership in health and global health, our values of leadership in development. The second half of the 20th century was much more stable than the first half of the 20th century because of that American leadership. And much of that leadership was our diplomats and the valued employees of the State Department. So I think certainly I speak for many of the members of this committee that we will do everything we can as we go through the budgeting process to get you the resources and the personnel to continue to do that exemplary job. But I thought it was very important to make sure those employees that are out there representing our great nation understand that many of us appreciate that service. Now, kind of getting back to some of the questions, I understand the president talks about an America First policy. I think the policy he's putting forth is going to make us weaker and have less influence around the world, and is not a reflection of what our values are. You know, Ms. Anderson, I want to make sure I heard correctly. The president's budget zeroes out all family planning funds.
For fiscal year 2018.
For fiscal. And a budget is a reflection of a president's values and so forth. That's our best reflection. So my opinion, it's appropriate. You know, when we talk about family planning, that's birth control, that's other forms of contraception. We're not talking about abortion because we've not been using federal funds for pregnancy termination. We've been using federal funds and working with NGOs and others historically to reduce the number of unintended pregnancies. And you know, that I think most global health experts, and I'm a physician who has worked internationally, would think that's appropriate. My colleague, Ms. Bass from California, talked about the importance of reducing maternal and child mortality. And one of those causes of maternal mortality is the spacing of pregnancy. So if it's in our values to reduce maternal mortality, we ought to make family planning funds more accessible. Now, without, I haven't asked any questions yet, because there's a lot on my mind here. I understand that there are members of Congress that are anti-choice, along with those that do want to empower women to be in charge of their full reproductive rights. But regardless, I think we all want to reduce the number of unintended pregnancies. And May 15th, the State Department released guidelines for the implementation of the Mexico City policy, the global gag rule, which my understanding is for the first time will apply to all global health assistance programs, many of which are in Africa. Now, this isn't the first time that this policy has been introduced. In fact, it seems to swing from administration to administration based on the party that's in charge. But if our goal is to reduce the number of pregnancy terminations and reduce the number of unintended pregnancies, what I will tell you is the last time this policy under George Bush was implemented, the number of abortions rose 20% as a result of curtailing the ability to have family planning out there. Ms. Anderson, would that be a somewhat accurate number?
I'm not certain I have that kind of data right now, but I certainly appreciate your point. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Earlier this year, I asked Secretary Tillerson a number of questions regarding this policy, including as they implement the Mexico City policy, would they be consulting with partners in the field, monitoring the impact of the policy on healthcare access as well as maternal mortality? And I think I was told that there would be a 6-month review of the policy as it was being implemented. Given the significant amount of healthcare funding we contribute to the Africa region, I've got a couple questions. The Bureau of African Affairs at State and the Bureau for Africa at USAID obviously is playing a role in implementing this policy and assessing the potential impact of the policy, such as, again, women's access to health care, family planning services, rates of unsafe abortion, and maternal mortality, including the 6-month review. Do you have any idea what the timeline for releasing the 6-month review is?
We're we're working to fully implement the policy, and I'd be happy to get back to you on that
Okay.
point.
If you could, that would be great. Again, as you're implementing this policy, and again, I'm not holding you or the wonderful employees of state accountable for this policy. But when I questioned Secretary Tillerson, one of the things was, look, if we ought to be checking on, is this impacting maternal mortality? What impact is it having on folks that are out in the field? What impact is it having on women's access to health care? So, you know, certainly, I think many on this committee would have a very big interest in how that policy is being implemented. I guess my last question, and maybe it's for Ambassador Yamamoto. You know, I am all for looking for efficiencies, looking for ways we can take our federal dollars and our taxpayer resources, partnering those with NGOs that are out there working in the field, whether those are faith-based groups or, you know, folks like the Gates Foundation, et cetera, and looking at ways of reducing morbidity and mortality and increasing health around the world. I just worry with the reduction in certain programs, it is actually not helping us leverage our dollars. It's actually reducing our ability to you know, have impact in the region. And yeah, I'd just be curious about your thought on that.
Let me give you something that you all worked on very hard, is that's the AGOA process. And I think that more than anything has given a lot of hope to Africa. Now, obviously, a lot of countries don't benefit, but actually, in many ways, they do. And we're just doing the data numbering, and we noticed that exports from the United States to Africa rose from $6 billion in 2000 to $25 billion. That means you're talking about, you know, well over 35,000 U.S. jobs. But on the reverse side is producing and expanding the capabilities for the Africans. You know, today they have a $500 billion total manufacturing output. That's going to be $1 trillion in the next decade, which means that we're going to help create hundreds of thousands of jobs in Africa. So that, I think, if we can continue to do that, and one of the areas that I think, you know, just in spite of the budget cuts and restraints, is that if we can continue our efforts on fighting corruption, building institutions, fighting back on non-tariff trade barriers, is really opening up businesses and trade, so that countries in Africa, their main trading partner is not going to be Europe or the former colonial countries, but each other, then we have the capability or ability to produce probably $100 billion in added value over the next several decades. That means that's going to create jobs, and when you create jobs, you create wealth and security. And those are the areas as how do you give them that hope? And those are the fundamental questions and issues that we're trying to struggle with. And what's the best way, the most efficient and effective manners? And I think some of the things that we're doing on the budget is that we are going to meet those needs through the AGOA, through a lot of the programs and projects that you've already set up. I mean, look at, for instance, YALI. So YALI is, we now have 74,000 applications for 700 fellowships to come to the U.S. And once they come to the U.S., they're going to add to the already 500,000 YALI groups that are all over Africa, being kind of like African ambassadors to the United States and vice versa, ambassadors to Africa, who are supporting and developing and expanding this relationship. And I think this has really been a very good program.
Will the gentleman yield?
Absolutely. Oh.
You just described YALI, which I would agree with you 100%. The YALI's being cut.
It is 50%. Yeah. But the areas that we're meaning is that, so we're getting 700 fellowships this year as opposed to 1,000. But then we're still going to continue to develop the fellowship programs and centers out in Africa. That's the issue.
If I could just chime in, we have had a fair amount of interest from private sector companies in contributing to YALI, especially the regional leadership centers in Africa. And we're hoping to mobilize those resources better in the coming years. We do have $5 million programmed for the regional leadership centers for 18.
Mr. Castro.
How is the morale at the State Department?
He can't answer that.
Well, let me tell you.
You don't have to answer it. I can ask you another question. Over the last year, there's been a growing call towards increased autonomy or even independence in Anglophone Cameroon. Cameroonian military has apparently been deployed in these regions, and the government has reportedly blocked social media and internet access on multiple occasions. Amnesty International recently reports that up to 17 protesters died, many by the hands of police. And so how is the State Department and USAID addressing this situation?
And thank you for your questions. And thank you for your concern on the issue. So Cameroon is a critical core country, not only security-wise, but also economic, because, you know, it forms the oil pipeline from Chad into Cameroon base. We've talked to President Biya a number. I've been almost on a monthly basis in my several years ago when I was the deputy in the bureau, to look at how you do the transitions. But more, I mean, from post-Biya, he's been in president for a long time, and how do you transition and prepare the country for a post-Biya or for a next leadership? The other issue too is how do you prepare and develop Cameroon's two groups of French-speaking and Anglophone, and it comes down to, do everyone have equal access to wealth and resources? 2, education. 3 is jobs. 4 is also is there equal opportunities for security and opportunities afterwards? And those are issues and challenges that we continue to face. So the fundamental issue is right now is that we've issued statements calling on the government and all sides to refrain and to from the violence.
But have we confronted them on the violence and the abuse and the murder?
We have. On President Biya and the government, we have. And we will continue to do so. And in my course of my going out to the region those be one of the first stops.
Thank you. And of course, as you know, this is an incredible time for refugees around the world. Many Syrian refugees in Europe. I spoke yesterday on the Rohingya Muslims who have fled or been pushed out to Bangladesh. Central Americans from the Northern Triangle who have come to the United States, and there are also refugees in Africa. So my question is, these refugees in Somalia, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic, when refugees move across borders, how have host governments responded in those areas? Are host governments able to provide for refugees, including food, water, shelter, and medicine? And what can the United States do to address any difficulties that these host governments face?
And you raise I think the fundamental difficult challenges. So if you have 65 million refugees worldwide, and if you look at the countries that have really taken in a lot of the refugees, it's really the countries around the areas of crises. So if you look at Somalia right now, you have Dadaab refugee camp, which most of us have gone to. I mean, it's the size of San Diego. If you look at the 1.3 million refugees coming out of South Sudan going into Uganda, or if you look at the refugee flows coming in Ethiopia, you see now we're seeing some flows of refugees out of the DRC into neighboring countries. And so the question is, we have the PRM, our Refugee Bureau, which looks at funding and assisting these countries to support the refugees. We also look at the UNHCR, the United Nations organizations. We look at other donor communities in support of these refugees. It's difficult. It's long term, but the issue is that it has to be immediate response because people are suffering as they go across the borders.
Sure. And then if you'll indulge me one more comment, Chairman, just for the record in this subcommittee, so much of the work that all of us care about, including the chairman's work over the years, which I've heard him speak strongly on human rights, for example, I believe much of that work is undercut by the budget cuts that we're seeing, and also by some of the changes in policy. I think that we're ceding a lot of ground to other countries like China, to go into places like Latin America and Africa and build stronger relationships than perhaps even some of the relationships that we have. And I see that that issue only growing in the coming years if we continue down this new path. So, but thank you all for being here. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. I do have one final question on peacekeeping. Before I get to that, just a point. Dr. Burrow raised the issue of the Mexico City policy. And I think people know that it got its name because under Ronald Reagan, it was announced at the UN Population Conference in Mexico City in 1984. And the policy was to say, we want to hold harmless unborn children, and who we contribute to does matter. If an organization wants to perform and promote abortion, except in the cases of rape, incest, and life of the mother, and that is the 3 exceptions contained in the Mexico City policy. If they want to do that, we believe that the unborn child should be held harmless. There are members of this committee, members of the House, and we just had a very divisive vote on pain-capable unborn children who at 20 weeks, we saw it, and it did pass the House with a rather significant majority, that pain-capable unborn babies ought to be protected. And I, during the course of that debate, quoted from a doctor, Dr. Levinol, who used to be an abortionist. He performed 1,200 abortions himself, over 100 on children up to 24 weeks gestation. And he told the story before the House Judiciary Committee how he would pull arms and legs off of a child. And he was numb to it. He felt it was an abortion, so therefore it was justified. And then he had a complete, total 180-degree change of heart and said, what am I doing? I'm pulling a baby apart. We know for a fact that children as early as 20 weeks survive at 20 weeks gestation, and that they're in nurseries, intensive care nurseries. And one of the doctors that I quoted as well, who works in a intensive care neonatal unit, talked about how her patients at 20 weeks, that if she were to go and pull an arm or a leg, delimb that child, that the pain that that child would suffer would be intense. So I believe, it's not shared by everyone, and I respect all people who have, whatever their view, that the most fundamental human rights issue of our time is protecting the innocent and the most vulnerable from violence. And I do believe that abortion is violence against children, and it also, and I work with a number of women who are post-abortive, that there are consequences for the women as well, particularly psychologically. Not all would agree with that, but there's no doubt that when you dismember or chemically poison an unborn child, it has a horrific impact on the child. The older he or she is, and the evidence is overwhelming, not even suggestive, but overwhelming, that they feel pain, and they feel it even more excruciatingly in a much deeper way than we do, because from 20 weeks to 32 weeks gestation, there are more receptors on the skin area available to the dismemberment, and the child just does feel it even more. Dr. Anand, who's an expert, has stated that in sworn affidavits on behalf of the Justice Department in courts of law. I say that because there will be obviously ongoing fights on this issue. President Obama reversed the Mexico City policy when he took office. President Clinton did the same thing. Ronald Reagan initiated it. George Herbert Walker Bush continued it, and George W. Bush reinstated it. I'm very proud of the administration for extending it to global health so that the child is held harmless. These are babies. The First Amendment I offered in the U.S. House of Representatives in committee, in the Foreign Affairs Committee, was to provide $50 million for the Child Survival Fund to promote immunizations, oral rehydration therapy, growth monitoring, and breastfeeding, the 4 pillars of child survival. Unfortunately, Ronald Reagan's David Stockman had suggested we take the $25 million that we had in that program and we get rid of it. I doubled it by offering my amendment. I do believe, respectfully to those who disagree, that abortion is antithetical to child survival because it literally takes the life of that child and destroys him or her. And disproportionately, women, girls, the girl child is killed. I chair the China Commission. China has, and we just released our most recent human rights report, because of sex selection abortion, China is missing 62 million or more girls, girl child, killed. More than that have been killed with sex selection abortion, but in my humble opinion, this is an act of gender crime when you single out a child at 5 months or so through ultrasound, discover that it's a girl. And there was a movie that even was put out that said the 3 most dangerous words that could be uttered in some parts of the world, it's a girl, because then she is targeted for elimination and extermination, simply because she's a girl. I, again, want to applaud the administration for saying, we will provide those monies, and you will get more than what you ask for a variety of programs, including family planning. But it will be with the caveat that we want to hold harmless that child from dismemberment or chemical poisoning, because that's the 2 ways that abortions are effectuated. Let me just ask one question, my final question, on peacekeeping. I'm concerned that the administration's budget, the FY17 enacted level was $1.9 billion. The proposal is for $1.2 billion. There are 21 peacekeeping efforts underway around the world. 6 are under the auspices of the African Union, 15 under the auspices of the United Nations. And Karen Bass and I, when we went to South Sudan, we've both been there a number of times. When we went there in June, we were happy to see that UNMISS, the UN deployment there, had greatly fine-tuned and bettered their rules of engagement because they had been wanting in many, many ways. I had been there a year before that, and frankly, they were not really protecting civilians. But I think you would agree, we found that there was an increased effort to try to be on the protection side and have, and really. But my question is, my concern, and I think it's shared by every member of this committee or subcommittee, is that a cut in peacekeeping, even though we always want them to do more with less, we want other countries, particularly in the EU, to step up and perhaps donate more, and I agree with that. But it is a bargain when it comes to deployment of getting troops highly trained. And in Africa, they're mostly African troops, not all, of course. But for the U.S. military, this is incredible value added, and for the civilians, the women and children especially, who suffer in these countries from rogue militaries as well as insurgents and terrorists, it is the difference between life and death. I want to encourage you to do what you can to be even more. I think personally both of you would be more supportive, but within the administration to say, this is a really good deal for protection. Making sure that the peacekeeping dollar is as high as it could be possibly be. And I say that with one other caveat that I know you're doing. As you know, I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and I work on that issue every single day. When we found that in the DR Congo, that the peacekeepers themselves were raping children as young as 13, there was an outrage and a human rights violation with very few parallels. I know that the UN peacekeeping leadership have gone through great lengths to try to really rein in on that egregious practice and have done so very successfully. It's not perfect, never is, but I want to applaud them in New York and those who are involved with this effort. Jane Hall-Lute, who used to work for the, she was one of the ones who helped get Kofi Annan to enact or put into place the zero tolerance policy. But again, our government, obviously our tip office, state and USAID, all of us together need to be pushing to make sure the peacekeepers are always on the side of protection and never on the side of exploitation. But if you could take that back about the $1.9 billion, and I think that needs to even augment upwards simply because of more need that is out there for peacekeeping. If you want to speak to that.
Sure, we will. And if I can just make one response. So Yes, absolutely correct is that the peacekeeping is critical. And again, I think the regional funding is going to help us support a lot of the areas where we have challenges that we have today, the G5 and the Central African Republic area, or in the future which may pop up, which we don't foresee now. But just looking at all the funding that the president has allocated, we're seeing them coming into Africa from the 131 million for the Lake Chad initiative. We have 121 million for the Trans-Sahel issue and 200 million for East Africa. But you're absolutely correct. We're going to look at very hard at how we can address security needs. But one thing that really stands out as great has been the ACOTA process. I mean, we just completed the training of over 300,000 African troops from 26 countries. And as you rightly say, Mr. Chairman, 70% of all the peacekeepers in Africa are from Africa. 70%. 84% of all UN peacekeepers are in Africa. And those troops, and thanks to Lady Vetting as well, have been very supportive. And so to contain and to change that mindset of these rogue armies and other areas in Africa. Can I just make one more comment off the record? Not off the record, but I mean it's in addition to the record. Yeah. So I know Congressman Castro made one comment, but the issue comes in is, let me just say that for my colleagues and I at the State Department is that, I worked at the National Defense University looking after our future leaders in the military and foreign affairs. And I was called and said, come back to the State Department to help the Africa Bureau. Well, that's not going to be not even a nanosecond. I said, yes, of course. And coming back to the Bureau, really, as a senior officer, our job and our commitment, and certainly my colleagues are the same, is to look at how do we mentor our officers. I've been away 3 years, and I think we have probably the youngest bureau in the Department of State. I mean, they're really young. And so I think my job and the job of our senior officers is really to mentor and to train and to develop them as future diplomats. And the other issue, too, is that I've been honored to work on our redesign on reform, personnel reform, is how do we develop and train our future officers? How do we do better mentoring? And I think that I'm really enthused about, and that's what gets me up every day, and that's what I want to do every single solitary day.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know from your general enthusiasm that your morale is high, and I think that's great. I don't know that translates throughout the department, but I think it is really important to have your spirits uplifted. I just wanted to mention a couple of things in terms of the USAID in particular, is that I hope when a reorg is happening that we look at doing foreign aid much more like the Feed the Future, Electrify Africa model, where it's not just about, it's not just charity. And, a continent like Africa has the capacity to do for itself, and we shouldn't just look at foreign aid as supplying resources to our own NGOs. Because then you have a model where it never ends. And I don't think that should be the case. And obviously the NGOs are very important, but there's enough poverty to go around, so it's not like they're going to go out of business. If, our focus is more on building self-sufficiency rather than, providing direct services. And I appreciate my colleague's comments, and I appreciate that he also respects that people see things differently, and the two of us do in some areas, but I think where we have a common perspective is on the family planning side. I mean, we were both in South Sudan, we were in the refugee camps, and you remember when we were in northern South Sudan, was that Bidi or was that?
Unity State.
Unity State. And there were all of these babies, and it just broke my heart because I knew that the majority of those babies were not created by partners. They were created through rape. And we saw the children right next to bodies of water, and it just made me, scared to death at how many drowning deaths they must have in that camp. And so I think the best way to prevent abortion is to provide family planning. And I don't think those women chose those pregnancies. Those pregnancies were forced on them. And so, we should look at that. We're zeroing it out. And once again, I think it's just an example of the hypocrisy of a lot of what is proposed in the budget. And I'm just glad that as Congress, we can, not follow and reverse some of the proposals that are put forward by the administration. Thank you.
Anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Just appreciate your comment about the redesign, and we have submitted our proposal, but we're keeping it close hold for now, so I'm not in a position to talk about it, but we do look forward to consulting as soon as we can, and your points are very similar to the points that Administrator Green makes every day in terms of real partnerships and moving our host country partners closer to self-sufficiency.
I want to thank both of you for your very, very noble service to our country. Thank you for your presentations today, and we look forward to working with you going forward. Hearing's adjourned.
Thank you.